My name's Todd Miranda. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use attached properties to store extra data in WPF. Let's begin in Microsoft Visual Studio 2008 and we'll choose File, New Project, and we're going to create a WPF Windows Application Project, and we'll name it accordingly. So there are times where when you're storing data in a particular control, we want to store maybe some extra data with that control, and the control may not really have a property available to store that data in. And one of the properties that we've used for many years to store kind of those extra little tidbits of data is the tag property, which exists on many of the controls that are in the framework library. However, what happens if you want to store more than one extra piece of data? Maybe you want to store a few extra pieces of data. Well, we can do that by using attached properties, because while the attached properties don't affect the functionality of the control itself, they're effectively a way that we can store data on that control by using a value of a property that's being attached to it. And it'll make more sense as we go on. Well, let's take the first thing we want to do is we know that we're going to have a loaded event. So let's just go ahead and add our loaded event. We'll do Tab to have Visual Studio automatically create our event handler for us. And let's go to our code behind. And let's create, we're just going to go down here, we're going to create a class, because we're going to need to, well, in our case, we're going to bind this class into our application so that we can use the data that's in our bound class. So we're just going to create a public class widget, and in here we're just going to have two properties. We'll have an int item amount get set, and now that makes a little more sense. I put a parentheses there instead of a bracket. And we've got a public int. And we're just going to call this threshold. Get set. Alright. So we're using some of the new shorthand syntax in C#. Okay. So now that we've got our object here, we know we've got an item amount and a threshold property. Let's go back over to our XAML and we'll build our user interface and we'll go ahead and set up our binding. So we're going to use the WYSIWYG part of our editor, and we're just going to add a line here for our grid, alright, so that our grid splits our page a little bit like that. And then we're going to add a button down here. So let's go into our controls. We'll add a button into this cell, and we'll put it right there. And let's add a text box up here in this row, and we'll just kind of center it a little bit like that. Should be fine. Okay, so here's our button, and we're going to name this button analyze, and we'll set its content to be analyze. Might not be the best title for a button, but that'll be fine. Alright, so obviously we'll rename our text box to text amount, and we're going to do some binding in here. So we want to take our text property and we want to use binding syntax. So we use binding, and we're going to bind this to the property called item amount for our text box, and this will allow us to change the text in our text box. Okay, so that's great. So now let's go to our button, and we're going to add a click event. we'll hit Tab to let Windows or let Studio go ahead and set our code behind up for us. So we got a click event. We're not really going to do anything with the click event just yet. So let's run this. Make sure we don't have any errors and see if it works the way we want it to. Alright, so we built, and there's our application. So we have our text box here that we can type in, and we've got our button here that we can click. That's a great first start. So let's go to our code behind, and on the loaded event, let's just say that and let's go back over here to our XAML, and let's name our grid. So we'll give our grid a name, and we'll call it grid root. Alright, and that way what we can do is we can go back over here, and we can set its data context equals new widget, and in here in widget we'll say item amount, and I did it again, I put a paren there. So here we'll do item amount equals, and we'll just say 25, and then we'll do threshold equals 10. Alright, so we've bound to item amount for our text box. So when we run this, we should see that our text box initial value is 25. So now we can go in and change that to something we want and click our Analyze button. Okay, so we've bound the data to our text box. Now let's say that the requirements for our application say that we can change that value, but you know what? When we change the value, we need to know what the original value was. So we need to have the original value. Alright, so that means we need to store some additional data in our text box so that we can analyze that data on the code behind. Well, that's pretty simple because we know that our text box has a tag property, so we can use the tag property to store this data. And the data is going to be the same data that we're storing in the text. So this is path, item amount, but we only want this to be stored once from the source, and then as I update the text, we don't want to, we don't want the two-way binding on this. We don't even really want one-way binding because this text property is going to update our original object, and that would update our tag. So let's just to make things simple, let's just do mode equals one time, and that way we'll simply bind in the beginning, and then we won't worry about binding anymore. So now we have our text and our tag property. So we come down here to button Analyze click, and we just simply say, let's make this easy. So we'll say, we'll do int new val equals, and we'll just do an int32.parse our text amount dot text, and then int old val equals int text amount dot tag. Alright, and we just convert it this way because tag is an object, so we can convert that to an int. Alright, so now we'll come in here and we'll say if new val is greater than old val, then we'll come in and we'll say message box dot show the new value is higher than the old value, and if it's not, we'll show the new value is not higher than the old value. Okay, so now we've used the tag property to store some additional data in our control. So now we do 25, we'll put 100 here, and we've got the new value is higher than the old value. All right, so far so good. But now let's say that we get a new requirement that's been added. And that new requirement is, you know what? The value can be changed by the user, but it cannot be changed more than the threshold. So we can't allow them to change the value more than that threshold value that comes in as part of our data. So we see we've got a threshold value here. All right. So that's no problem, we think. Let's go back over to our UI, and we're like, that's fine because we can store that in the tag. Well, wait a minute. We can't store it in the tag property because I'm already using the tag property. So I've got my text that I'm using. I've got my tag property I'm using. There really isn't anything else. So where am I going to store this additional data that I want to store with my text box so that I can figure out whether they've crossed the threshold or not? I really don't want to have to look at the original value and try to do some kind of query to get the original object and things like that, or to pull that out of the data context, because there may be situations where the data context no longer exists, let's say. So in this case, we want to store it with our text box. Well, that's okay, because even though there's not a property directly on the text box that we can use, the text box does have attached properties that we can store additional data in. So let's see. We want to be able to store a numeric value, so either an int or a double type value for a threshold. So what properties could take that type of data type? Well, we could do storyboard, because we know that storyboard has some attached properties. So we've got storyboard.targetName, storyboard.targetProperty. Well, those are both strings. So, that would work. We could kind of convert from a string to an int, but maybe there's something that fits a little bit better. So, how about canvas.top? Now, since we're not in a canvas, this attached property won't have any effect on the application at all. So, we can use it free of charge. We'll do binding path equals threshold. Okay, so again, since we're not in a canvas, we're actually in a grid, the canvas.top property will have no effect on anything. It's just simply an attached property that sits there and takes up space that really has no effect on functionality. But we're going to use it to store some additional data. So even though it doesn't affect functionality, it is a property that lives in the text box so that we can store data in it. And it's pretty much the type of data that we want. Granted, it's a double and we're dealing with an int, but it's numeric, so that kind of gets it's a good example to use. As opposed to using storyboard.target property or target name, we use canvas.top because at least it's a numeric type property. Okay, so now we've bound the threshold into canvas.top. So now let's go to our code behind and let's see how we can use that. So we said that canvas.top was actually a double. So let's just do int, because our threshold is an int. Let's do thresval equals convert dot to int32, and now we're going to get our attached property. So we've got text amount dot get value, because this is the way we get and set the attached properties, is using get value and set value. And then we're going to pass to get value the dependency property, which is canvas.top. Now remember that when we're using this as a dependency property, we have to specify the full property name of our property, which in this case is not top, it's top property. Alright, and there's our convert. So now we've pulled the threshold value out of the attached canvas.top property, and we can come in here, we can add an additional conditional, and we'll say and new val minus old val is less than or equal to thresval. Alright, so the difference between the two is less than or equal to our threshold. Alright, and then we'll say the value change is valid if it's less than our threshold, and the value change is not valid if it's outside of our threshold. So let's run our application. Here's our window. We'll change the value to 100, hit Analyze, and we get the value change is not valid because we have a threshold of 10 and our difference here is 75. So let's just make this 30. The original value is 25. That's only a 5 difference. The value change is valid. Okay, so we were able to meet all of our requirements, and we effectively were able to store 3 pieces of data in our text box, even though we know we'd have 1 with text. Most controls that are framework elements have the tag property because that comes from framework element, so we could use that for an additional data storage piece. But then we were kind of out until we realized that we could use an attached property to store another data value that we could use on the back end to either do some logic or just to store values that we could then write back to the database or write back to our data store somewhere. So using attached properties, not just for layout type purposes or the purpose that the attached property was really meant for, but a kind of a different use for that attached property is to be able to get into those areas and store some additional data in there where normally you don't have any place to store it.